I think it's really interesting how Nintendo has sort of, like housed the bossa nova genre. They've kind of made it their own. If you're Gen Z or younger, you can listen to, Brazilian instrumental, bossa nova music and probably think to yourself, hey, this sounds like Nintendo. I had a professor during my Berkeley master's program, and he was from Brazil, and he gave a great presentation on the world of Brazilian music, and it included, of course, bossa nova music. I mentioned during that class, just the irony of Nintendo, who's a Japanese video game company, adopting those ideas, musical ideas. It's like they found a new home for the genre.
Very, very Latin genres seem to be what Nintendo take from, because I guess it's so approachable and so intertwinable with any other genre. You can entangle that, like those elements, really in a lot of music.
With the communication technology we have, we're able to share musical ideas, overseas so easily. This is really obvious in the United States as a melting pot, just to have music from different places coming into one place, and that's how new musical genres are formed. That's why we have blues, that's why we have rock and roll, everything.
Video game music within itself as well is a cultural entry point into music. A really good example of this, I would actually say, is the Mario Kart soundtrack, because Mario Kart is often, it's often jazz, but more modern Mario Kart games have taken an approach of having music that is more sort of jazz fusion. And jazz fusion is a genre that back in the 80s and 90s for sort of corporate Japan was very big, and Mario Kart and a lot of games from back then were these entry points into those genres becoming well known across the world.
Nintendo, they just have a vibe about their music. It's not just when bossa nova grooves are being played. I'll find myself saying, this sounds like Nintendo also, and sometimes it's maybe because it's in a bossa groove, and if it's not, then there might be some other reason. But when I wrote my first track for this album, which I called Start Game, that was just what I wanted to roll with, was this classic Nintendo sound. And yes, it does have a bossa nova groove in it. I wanted to write something with the Nintendo cliches. It's groovy, feels colorful, and, just has the aesthetic of Nintendo. If you want to listen to my full album, the links are in the description. If you don't have Apple Music or Spotify, you can also listen to the album for free on YouTube Music. When I wrote my very first Mario track, I wanted to focus on emulating the audio limitations of the hardware at the time. That sort of dictated how I wrote it. I limited it to 4 instruments, 4 different waveforms for 4 different parts, with a constricted number of sound chips to fill each musical role. There was a pulse wave for the melody, another pulse wave for the harmony, a triangle for the bass, and a noise channel or white noise for the percussion. A 5th sound chip would be possible on the NES. It was, occasionally used for sample playback, but it was optional.
I've written music for different sound chips before. The one that I primarily have written for, because I primarily work with Sonic, is the Sega Mega Drive sound chip. And that's, a bit more hands-on-y, because with the Sega Mega Drive, it was all FM audio. So you have 5 FM channels, you have a DAC to sample things in, and then you get 3 square waves from the other sound chip in that console. And that's really interesting because it means you have so many possibilities to make interesting, intricate sounds. You can basically whip up any style, but you're still within this interesting limitation of just having a synthesized audio. And it's actually quite interesting because the limitations on that bred creativity more than anything, because they were able to make amazing songs with the limitations of only having 5 FM channels to use and a drum track that they could put in or out at any time. when console manufacturers were usually designing game consoles, audio was the last thing on their minds because everyone cared about the graphics. It didn't really matter if the game sounded like beeps or bloops or like any actual sound, because at the end of the day, people were glued to whatever their eyes would see. So sound was often sacrificed, in fact, in this era. But it's amazing to think how much prevalence game sounds have now. But even then, like the culture that's come from it.
Most Mario tunes, including the main theme itself, are known for bouncy syncopated rhythms, Latin grooves, and jazz harmonies. Notice here how the upbeats are where most of the notes lie in the melody, creating a balance for the playful nature that Mario has.
Mario music is very playful with its harmonies. It's able to use complex harmonies in a way that still feels quite natural, but it can bounce from one to another. And that's with a very intricate knowledge of very specialized jazz chords, different voicings, inversions, the uses of like the 7th, the 9th, the 11th, 13th, all that, in a nicely compact way. Because that's what jazz is all about. You have such complexity, and yet Mario music at its core is very simple in a way. It turns very complex concepts into something simplistic and fun, and that's where the charm comes from as well, I think.
I do recommend listening to more of the soundtrack, whether it's the 16th note pattern of the underground theme, the 3/4 waltz of the underwater theme, or the box-styled arpeggios that you hear in the castle music. The whole game, musically, is just so compositionally unique, and sometimes we forget how good it is just because the filtered chiptune sounds that we end up hearing when we play the game. When I wrote my Super Mario Bros. Inspired theme, I really wanted to focus on those, syncopated, bouncy rhythms and the chiptune sounds, and that became the second track on my album, which I called Super Musical Bros. A lot of the original synth instruments of these video game tunes were hard to track down, and sometimes I had to rely on Soundfonts. Soundfonts allow us composers to use the iconic synth instruments that we recognize from our favorite video game tunes. And my Super Mario World inspired track was definitely a product of one of these Soundfonts. The sound font allowed me to use that iconic steel drum sound.
There is nothing more fun than the idea, at least to me, of knowing what a composer not only used to write, but the way they used it. I think that is, and it's so fascinating to have access to such sounds as well. It's not just an interest in what was like how it was made. It also creates the ability to use it yourself and bring a creative twist to a familiar sound. You have all these people using, Soundfont recreations of game audio, but there's something really special in having the original sources, especially when you can then go back and compare it to the audio from the original game and can hear how it originally sounded before it might have been compressed to fit on the hardware. It kind of gives me this kind of like mental imagery as well of the idea to remember that composer of that song you liked sat down in front of their piano one day or their computer and they wrote that song, and they had to scroll through a list of presets before they landed on the one that they liked and used it in the song. That is another thing about source sample findings as well. You get to find overlap between different series as well. Mario might have used the same sound that was used in Sonic or Zelda or Portal. As weird as these examples go, but then you hear them in different contexts of different songs and you think, wow, there are so many ways you can utilize one sound.
I also used a library called Super Audio Kart. Compositionally, I focused on that playful Mario feel in the melody, but I also paid attention to the rhythmic motions of the bass and the harmony, the harmonic rhythm.
When you think of a game in conversation, is always going to be the soundtrack, and that, in my eyes, you vocalize it, and everyone is very familiar with the first few notes that goes da 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 da. You sing that to many people, they will remember that, and so that's the telling of time that that's an iconic memory for anyone.
There are some other iconic themes in Super Mario World, not just the overworld theme, and one of my personal favorites is this Beethoven-styled castle theme. That being said, when I wrote my original Mario World inspired theme, I dedicated it to the styles of the overworld theme. For my next Mario-inspired track, I once again relied on a sound font. In fact, there's a Google spreadsheet that has a ton of sample sources written down for video game music, in case you're wondering where a particular sample or sound came from. I wanted to find the sounds of Mario Party 4 on this spreadsheet, but it has a limited number of identified samples, which I don't really have access to. But I ended up finding sound fonts for the N64 Mario games, and what I came up with sounded kind of like a jungle theme, which in my head I associated with DK's Jungle Adventure from the original Mario Party. My biggest takeaway from the Mario Party games is just its nostalgia. If there's a particular game you grew up with, you're probably familiar with the music and the technology of its time.
Music technology evolved kind of at the same rate as video games did. Back in the 90s and the early 2000s, we were using, synth romplers and stuff. And I've got two on my desk right now from the 2000s. And, they're not exactly orchestral machines. You could make really good music with them, and you could make an orchestral song with them, but they're not exactly going to beat, the modern day libraries, which now you hear all the time in a video game. And that's the thing. That's the exciting prospect of nostalgia, where that more simplistic sound brings us great joy. The evolution of music was tied to the evolution of game.
In all honesty, I'm more familiar with Mario Party 4, so when I was writing this track, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do with it. So you'll hear some sound effects from Mario Party 4, but the music is in the style of the original Mario Party. When it comes to the music of Mario Kart, it needs to be obviously fast-paced, usually big and bombastic, and really just focusing on the high-energy feel that is any version of Mario Kart. I eventually want to write something in the style of Mario Kart Wii and Mario Kart 8, but until then I did something in the style of Mario Kart DS.
Mario Kart goes for jazz fusion. Not every entry does, but it's a very vital part of the Mario Kart evolution, because later on you get things like techno influenced into it. But the very foundation was Latin, samba, and jazz fusion. And jazz fusion, the only reason why, believe it or not, Mario Kart likely had that influence was because at the time, Formula One racing in Japan, the associated music was jazz fusion. So Mario Kart also shows a history of the time it was made that then outlived that, because Mario Kart is still going the jazz fusion route. I mean, I don't know if you've heard Mario Kart World soundtrack, but that is the most 80s or 90s jazz fusion game soundtrack ever. You get so much range from Mario Kart as well, because there's so much variance in the game, and I think variance in the game matters a lot, because Mario Kart has some of the most variants. They can still shake it up by introducing sort of variants in the genres they're writing in while still keeping it energetic, where they might have a slow melody, but there might be, the percussion might amp up to keep the track moving, where they might have a fast melody, and so they'll bring the percussion back just a bit so that the melody can speak the environment and the vibe that the track should give you at that time.
The track I wrote was actually inspired by the style of Waluigi Pinball. There are some other great tunes and maps in Mario Kart DS, but Waluigi Pinball was always my favorite in this game. Once again, I used a sound font for the Mario Kart DS inspired track. The Nintendo Wii has such amazing music. While the instruments are MIDI and not live players, it's emulating the sound of real players. Has an instrumental pop band sound, has some jazz harmonies woven into the music.
I think the Wii era was when Nintendo found a sound, and they utilized the growing music technology as well so effectively. I mean, it's so iconic that I've bought the synthesizers that Nintendo like to use. They like to use Yamaha's Motif series that was just getting very popular. I've got one, and I have a Roland Phantom X, which was basically the Nintendo synth of the 2000s, like late 2000s to early 2010s. That, because it's just so iconic, the sounds of these machines shaped a whole era of Nintendo music, because you have Wii Sports, Wii Play, Wii Party, Wii Fit. Those games kind of are an umbrella, really, to a larger sound style that then delved off, as you say, to the 3DS and the Wii U, which they're very much like my analysis of the 3DS era is. It is different. It's still a very different sound, but it's still rooted in this kind of excitement for technology. I think that's the way I'm going to put it. The Wii era, music-wise, was an excitement for technology because it all delves into electronic. There's a very common presence of beeps and bloops, basically, but not in kind of what people would consider, I'm going to use this term very loosely, but obnoxious, where, the beeps and bloops, some people would be like, I'll turn that off, it's annoying. The very friendly, charming, and very iconic, and you can utilize that to an advantage of the sound.
In the case of the Mii channel or the Wii Shop theme, we also get that Bossa sound. The Mii channel inspired tune that I wrote focuses less on the bossa grooves and more on the, piano and electric piano sound palette that the Mii channel is known for. The Wii Sports music is, filled with such excellent ideas compositionally, in the instrumentation. The Wii Sports theme has, the slash chords and stepwise motion. And Wii Sports Resort, on the other hand, has more of a laid-back country club feel.
The unfortunate aspect of video game music is, and this is still a thing, it was very misrepresented for years because unfortunately the hardware wasn't there, and then by the time the hardware got there, the stigma was there, because you still have people who will go on record to say things like, imagine listening to game music, and it's like, there's not really much of a difference between listening to game music and music you like. I mean, I get it, game music is fit for a purpose, it's to like film scoring. It's just to enhance the feeling and the atmosphere of a scene. So it's doing a more passive job, because film score is very reflective of what's going on the scene. Whereas a game's soundtrack needs to be respecting or reflecting multiple things that can happen at once. And in a way, it's just music again. Game music is so diverse, and as the technology evolved, it only got more and more diverse.
For the Wii Sports inspired tracks, I figured there was enough room for contrast between those two styles that I was able to make two different ones that were somewhat different than each other. Going from Wii Sports to Pac-Man is such an abrupt transition. So I made a track, I called it Bonus Level, and this is really just meant to bridge the gap between both musical styles. I knew that it would be wrong of me to not tribute the early days of retro arcade games. Super Mario Bros. Is kind of the odd one out because, you know, it's kind of turned into this massive franchise. But if you look at games like Space Invaders and Galaga, I wanted to pick a couple of those types of games to make a tribute to. And as you saw in the main presentation, I picked Pac-Man and Tetris. As I mentioned in the first video, the Pac-Man inspired music that I wrote was originally a piano piece that I had written. I wanted to focus on, you know, that feel of being half a step away from the root chord. All I had to do from there was just assign the notes to the chiptune sounds. When it comes to Tetris, you know, there's so many iterations of the game, and usually the music just takes pre-existing music, which of course is the case of Koroboniki, which is the most well-known Tetris theme.
Game music was so derivative of its time. I'm sure you've heard the examples of Koji Kondo on Super Mario Bros. The songs he was influenced by, where he would actually just take parts of them to implant on Mario.
Going back to Tetris, the theme of Koroboniki just fits perfectly. It's the theme that people associate with Tetris. You know, it's catchy, minor key, it's very diatonic to the key. And that was compositionally what I want to focus on was, you know, not really going outside of the key and staying very tonal. And that's how I wrote my Tetris-inspired track. Undertale is brilliant in so many ways. I think it's the game that has amazed me the most. And there's so many different ways that it's amazing, but of course my favorite, which is a little biased, but my favorite is of course the music. The opening theme is iconic, but it feels like the arcade tunes that we just listened to.
Could you imagine playing Undertale and the first thing you hear on this, you know, very clearly like 8-bit inspired art is a fully orchestrated piece? There would be such a disconnect there. My favourite game soundtrack of all time is the soundtrack to Sonic Mania. And this fits into the conversation perfectly because Sonic Mania is a retro throwback game. It's a 16-bit inspired Sonic game that took the art style of the originals, beefed it up a little bit to make it look a bit nicer and cleaner and more fit for modern practical purposes. But the soundtrack of that game really intrigues me because it was very clearly made out of a love and admiration for the Sonic soundtracks. But it's also an admiration of the era-appropriate sound design where, yeah, it's very clearly a modern produced soundtrack, and it's very clearly a throwback soundtrack, but it does something very unique where it uses classic synthesizers in a more modern context. I love that, and I think that's fantastic. And one of the things I love about that soundtrack is just how it very clearly takes a rooted approach of being video game music over what the video game music of the time was trying to be more pop or trying to replicate what was in the charts at the time.
Going back to Undertale, the 8-bit visuals just require chiptune music. It just makes more sense. It uses that early retro chiptune style, and harkening back to that sound was what I did with my first Undertale-inspired track. Not only does Undertale take advantage of that retro style in its music, but it also focuses on leitmotifs and associating themes, musical themes, with characters, places, and specific things in the game.
I like Undertale's leitmotif usage because it's not just characters or scene, it's concepts. He uses leitmotifs for ideas, and you have to do it tastefully and you have to do it appropriately, and I think that soundtrack is one of the best examples there is of a leitmotif in a game.
Sampling is such a cool technique in electronic music. There's so many ways that you can twist and turn just a blip of an audio file and turn it into a new instrument.
Quite recently, I needed to, sample. I wanted to have a shaker on a song, but I didn't want to go through all my libraries just to find, a shaker loop. I decided, you know what, I'm going to do it by myself. I went downstairs and I looked in the cupboards and I had a pepper grinder. I picked it up, shook it, and I thought, that's my shaker. Went upstairs, recorded the shaker, sampled it.
Toby Fox, for Undertale, was notorious for not just sampling when he was writing the songs, but he would also sample for things like character voices.
Maybe it's the way you're dressed.
You think of Flowey's lines in Undertale are from a McDonald's commercial from like the 70s or 80s.
That's a wonderful idea. That's a wonderful idea.
Musically, sampling has a really amazing power, which is, being able to create original sounds, being able to invent new instruments using, blips of sound sources. There's always new sounds to be discovered because of this, and it's a technique that I think all composers should explore more. Sometimes I wonder if, because of the evolution of music in the last 100 years, that we've run out of new genres. But every time I consider that, I'm always proven wrong. The music of Undertale is one of those things that proves me wrong. It's just a very special niche soundtrack, and it's very original in its style. It kind of just has become like its own micro subgenre. And that's what I focused on when I, wrote my third Undertale-inspired track.
A composer doesn't think really of the sound that they write until other people want to take from it, and that is the fascinating part. You have people so dedicated to a sound as well that they learn the style, they learn the quirks, they learn the details, they learn how to mix and master and produce the music and that stuff. That's me in Sonic Mania. I know how that soundtrack was produced. I can recreate the style perfectly based on what I've learned, and that is something I adore.
Every video game needs sounds to be associated with it. And a shooter game like Call of Duty, it doesn't really need music during the gameplay, especially when you're playing multiplayer.
We dropped their flag. Hostile flag returned.
Dropped him. Shoutout.
Usually you just hear the music, either in the beginning of the match or at the end of the match.
Capture the objectives. Ready for deployment. Good job, Grunts. Get ready for the next round.
Those beginning and ends of a game like that are essential to probably setting the pace and the vibe of the game itself.
If you increase that intensity before the game comes to a close, then, that raises the stakes of what you're feeling as the player. It works really well when you're playing Call of Duty in multiplayer mode. Besides the in-game music, a game like Call of Duty, especially if you're playing multiplayer, menu music is really important. In between each match, you want to have a sound that you can associate, with the world of the game that you're playing. And when I wrote my tune, Capture the Flag, I just wanted to create a sound that felt like the world of Call of Duty. Playing Halo differed from my playing experience with Call of Duty. Because with Call of Duty, I was more drawn to playing in multiplayer, whereas Halo, I'm usually playing the campaign. And musically, there's differences as well between a multiplayer experience and a campaign experience. The campaign should feel cinematic and large, and with the sci-fi aesthetics of Halo, there's a lot you can do there, both during the battles and during the cutscenes.
things of like shooter games, I think the music again seems more cinematic in nature. It really wants to amplify the real cinematic moments where the intensity might be delivered by just what's going on in the scene rather than the sound.
Cutscene music is really important for campaign because game composers kind of score it like they would a film. These are moments in the game that are timed just like film, and so you could drop it into your DAW and score it like it's a movie.
With Visegrad Relay was lost last night. All signals flatlined at 2600 hours. I responded with trooper fire teams, which have since been declared MIA.
The Halo-inspired track I wrote, captures the aesthetics of Halo, but it's also something that I can imagine either during a cutscene or during a battle in campaign, or honestly in both. In the main presentation video, I showed an Fmod Unity demo, which was of a Unity first-person shooter micro game. Music in games really differ from, music in film, because of how much it's changing and when it's changing. We, as composers, sound designers, or, audio directors, we use audio middleware to create these advanced audio systems. At the end of the day, we want the music to feel smooth and seamless as it changes and transitions. And there's a lot of techniques that can help us with that. One of them is loops. If the player puts down the controller, then at some point the music is going to stop. So the solution to that is to create a loop region so that the music loops back to a certain point once it finishes. Okay, that's better, but the loop still feels abrupt and unnatural, so how do we make this feel more seamless and clean this up? What you want is a reverb tail to play simultaneously with the loop point. It'll make it feel like the music is repeating without an abrupt change in the sound. When it comes to decision making in games, one decision may lead to one music trigger, and another decision might lead to another music trigger. Sometimes this isn't even just about a decision, but about advancing through a specific portion of a game. You can use game states and game parameters to affect which music is currently playing at a given moment, and something in the game might trigger that change. Another technique I love is vertical layering. This one is so interesting, and it's, in my opinion, the coolest technique. Basically what happens with vertical layering is that you have multiple stems playing at once, but a certain game parameter will be linked to a certain audio parameter. An example of this is in Mario Kart 8 during the Dolphin Shoals track, where the music changes from when you're underwater to when you come above water. So basically what's happening there is they're both playing at once, except the volume of one is all the way up here, and then when you go above water, it switches. Another example of this is the tightrope game in Wii Fit. Listen for the tremolo strings as the player loses balance. You have your music playing here, and then as the player loses balance, the tremolo strings go up, and then if you regain balance, then it goes back down.
And there's another one, I can't remember, I think it's the obstacle course, where the further you progress in the course, the more the music builds. You'll start to hear elements come in, and until it's this grand ensemble of playing this song.
You can create parameters in Fmod or Wise to sneak an instrument in or out, depending on how you want it to relate to in-game events. Moving on from video game techniques, I wanted to tribute 3 of my favorite Valve games in Volume 1. These games ended up being the original Half-Life, Portal, and Portal 2. Half-Life being a game from 1998, sounds like a game from 1998. It's still very playable and it is timeless, even though, you can tell that it wasn't made last year.
I do think Half-Life has a very interesting soundtrack. It's a Valve sound. It's weird. Valve have a sound for music, and their sound of music was very environmentally focused.
Musically, I wanted to find a contrast between the more rhythmic parts of the music and the more atmospheric parts of the music, while still sounding like a soundtrack from a 1998 game. And that was the goal with my Half-Life inspired track, which I call Black Mesa. The first Portal game, feels so dark and desolate, and it's like a liminal space.
I've always said this, I adore the soundtrack of Portal because a lot of it is just very ambient. It's not a driving force song that makes you want to keep going. I always listen to that soundtrack and sit there and I think like, wow, could you imagine being here in this place right now and the sudden feeling of what you should feel is alone.
It feels this way until the infamous "the cake is a lie" part of the game, where you're nearly thrown into a fire pit and you have to portal your way out of there. What I wanted to do with my Portal-inspired track was to capture the sounds and aesthetics and that feeling of that moment where you have to force yourself out of there, which is really where the game really shifts. Portal 2 felt quirkier, refreshed, had more personality to it. The visuals capture the essence of the passing of time.
The first one is more desolate, and then Portal 2 is very electronic, but also it's very orchestral, it's very grand, and it shapes around that, and I adore that. There is something so amazing about Portal 2's soundtrack and how it can go from grand to electronic. And some of my favourite songs in Portal 2 are really the ones that are mysterious. The ones where you have like a great example is like there's this thing Muraski will do in Portal 2 soundtrack where he will have like an E piano that just over a choir, and an E piano is something very basic, like a Rhodes or a anything like that, but it's just being over a choir makes suddenly this little E piano playing this mysterious melody feel so grand and big. And then there's something that I think that we're both kind of forgetting as well is the way these games end with a musical number from GLaDOS.
This was a triumph. I'm making a note here, huge success. It's hard to overstate my satisfaction. Well, here we are again. It's always such a pleasure. Remember when you tried to kill me twice?
And then that was all done by, those songs were written by Jonathan Coulton, weren't they?
The moment that I wanted to focus on was when GLaDOS reawakened in the mess of what is left of Aperture Science, and the feeling that you're going to continue to be forced into testing for her, knowing that you might not make it out of there alive this time. The music of Portal 2 feels classical, almost like a Bach fugue.
Now he's playing classical music.
I wanted to capture the same classical melodic gestures, but using the sound design that Portal 2 is known for. It's very unlikely to take, a synth instrument that sounds like it should be in a dubstep tune and pair it with a very classical sounding melody. And that was one of my main goals with my Portal 2 inspired track. video games like Geometry Dash are just so much more fun when there is a level editor and when you can build your own stuff.
It's fun because that also means that your creation became part of the game. People can play your level and get stats, and that is a very essential and interesting thing. There is something so fun about making and getting more of what you love from people who are passionate, as passionate about it as you are. That's why I love fan creations and level editors and all that, because it creates more content for the things you enjoy.
Geometry Dash is in a lot of ways a music game. It's not a rhythm game, but it is a music game. Every level in the game needs music. The only time there isn't music are during transitions in the platformer levels.
One thing about Geometry Dash as well, since we had the platformer mode, the genres that people tend to use has expanded, because no one really was using orchestral music. Geometry Dash was primarily focused on electronic, and now it's evolved. I'm very thankful for the options of music that people could use, because it introduced me to so many electronic genres that shaped a lot of my preference growing up as a teenager. So I have quite a lot of nostalgia for it, but I also find it to be very vast and just fascinating in general. That is always going to be the thing that is fascinating with Geometry Dash.
These 4 tracks that I wrote in Volume 1 that were inspired by Geometry Dash, they came out before Update 2.2 was released. Volume 1 was released 18 days before Update 2.2 came out. And so because of this, there aren't any Update 2.2 inspired tracks, but there's definitely going to be in Volume 2. The artist Waterflame, who has written several tunes that ended up in Geometry Dash, sometimes he uses samples of dialogue. And I wanted to do something similar to this when I wrote my Waterflame inspired track, which I called The Golden Age. So in the style of Waterflame's music, you'll hear those bit crushed voices in there. F777's music is what inspired me when I wrote my Here Be Dragons track. There's actually a specific album of his that I used for inspiration, and that was the Pirate Dance Music album, which contains the 7 C's as you hear in Geometry Dash Meltdown. And that was the style I went with for Here Be Dragons. I knew I wanted to write music for a demon difficulty level, even though it wasn't actually rated demon, not yet at least, but it's as difficult as one would be. I called it the Demonator. The Demonator! The goal for me with this one was just to sound scary. It kind of ended up sounding like a factory malfunction, which in a lot of ways really worked. I may or may not be doing a sequel to that one. Anyways, moving on to my final Geometry Dash inspired track. Like I said, I released Volume 1 before 2.2 came out, so my final Geometry Dash inspired track is just a dedication to the long-lasting 2.1 era of the game. I called it End of an Era. This is in no particular style, it's kind of just basic EDM, but it's also something that I could imagine in a Geometry Dash level and something that I made a level for. So I want to give a shout out to my friend Chillius, who's also known as Chillius VGM. He and a team of people made a fan-made soundtrack to, is Morrisons?
Morrisons, yes. That was an album we made, me and some people. We all grew up with the Nintendo 3DS era of music, and it's very charming to us. Us being major synth nerds and Nintendo music nerds, we wanted to make something that really said, our biggest thanks and love to that era of music, and it was born from a silly joke, but I think it really led to that, and it was simply just we wrote a supermarket app, because in recent times we've seen an influx of detailed soundtracks for the most mundane tasks, you know. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but in Japan there was a McDonald's training game, and that game had an amazing soundtrack, so it was kind of something in the same spirit as that. We just simply made an entire soundtrack to an application that doesn't exist. For a laugh, it was a silly concept that kind of went a bit too far, but in the end it was really a love letter to the greatest greatest era of Nintendo music I personally grew up through.
The idea of making a boss fight track was actually not my idea, it was Chillius's idea. I think having a track like that brings the album to life, also with start game, bonus level, and game over. I don't want every track to just be inspired by the music of other games. I want this whole project to be a celebration of video game music in general. And so having a boss fight, you know, towards the end of each album, I think was a neat idea. When I first saw the Wii Sports Resort Fusion made by Animal Crossing, I was just blown away. I thought it was an excellent idea. It's so cool, the idea of showing, you know, a particular theme and putting it through various sounds that are associated with different games. We're all familiar with the sounds of our favorite game soundtracks, so I wanted to do the same thing with my final track. Naming the final track Game Over was such an easy idea. I feel like video games don't really end anymore, or at least modern games don't. You beat Minecraft, you know, and then when you finish you can, I don't know, work on your house or your farm. You beat Portal 2. Okay, now go play the community test chambers. There's always extra content, and even if the game is more linear and there isn't extra content, every time you play a game, you'll get a different experience. You'll discover new techniques, find new ways to play. And as we all know, game over doesn't mean game over. It just means, hey, you lost, try again. And that idea opens a door to Volume 2, which is going to start with a track titled Continue Game. Game over just means try again and continue the game. And while this marks the end of Volume 1, symbolically it leads into the next chapter that I'm going to try to bring with Volume 2.